Hey there, everyone. This is Clay, and this is going to be another video in our little course here on communication. And to get things started off here, just had a couple of little housekeeping elements to bring up. So I pinned a comment at the top of the Facebook group, and I was hoping that I could just put links to all the individual units in that comment, but it seems it's not really working so well. It worked totally fine on my computer, but it doesn't seem to work so well with phones and on mobile. So I might just go ahead and just pin whichever is the most recent unit to the top there. So you're seeing this one. This is probably going to be the one that's pinned unless it's been a few days and I've made another lesson. So anyway, that is what's going on. Also, I do try to wear different color shirts in each video so that if you're just kind of scrolling through and you happen to see a video and you say, oh, I haven't seen Clay in a maroon red shirt before, that must be a new one. So I'm going to do that as long as I can. I'm getting a little bit low on different colored shirts here, so we'll have to see how this works out. But that's the housekeeping stuff. And with that being said, let's go ahead and get into a brief recap of what we've covered so far, just to make sure that we're all following along and that this is all making sense for everyone. So we've started by looking at this path towards commitment as not just like one thing that you do. You know, it's like maybe you're way back here and you somehow write a letter, and that letter is supposed to carry everything all the way over towards being committed, or some sort of text message that is supposed to do all the work of getting towards a commitment, or one conversation or anything like that. Can it happen? I suppose so. Have I ever really seen that? Honestly, no. It doesn't mean it's outside the realm of possibility, but I've never personally seen that. What usually happens is, if you think about this more like a game of golf or a hole of golf, where you start typically pretty far away from the hole, and then you just kind of take a few just bumped my desk there. Take a few swings, a few strokes to get closer and closer and closer until eventually we're in the hole and you have your commitment. And it doesn't matter if you get it as a hole in one. It doesn't matter if it takes several strokes or whatever. As long as you get towards the commitment, that's really all that matters. Nobody's keeping score here. And of course, what you do to get the ball closer to the hole is that you focus on connection, and specifically on starting by demonstrating to your ex or your partner that you understand where they're coming from, that you understand what they are thinking and feeling. We often think about communication as like, okay, what are the words that I say to express how I feel so that someone else gets it? But what can often be more powerful is to first start by listening, first start by hearing what the other person is saying. And then when they are understood and heard, it actually acts as a disarming sort of feature. I think I talked about this in one of the other videos. I've been making a lot of like YouTube videos and doing a lot of coaching calls recently. So sometimes I forget what I've said on one of those versus what I've said on one of these videos. But you can think about it like your ex has this sort of complicated world of emotions that's sort of wrapped in this protective armor, this protective shell. And that sort of expresses itself as defensiveness. And if you can just show them that you understand them and where they're at, it can often disarm that defensive shell, cause it to come off, and allow the two of you to actually have a conversation about what's going on beneath the surface. And so what we want to do first in order to get that ball moving closer to the hole is to start by understanding your ex and understanding their position, their concerns, their emotions, whatever it is that they're going through. We also talked about in the previous video what we call the triangle of commitment. And those are the three elements that typically come out of alignment when I'm looking at a relationship and why it's not working. And of course, if you bring these into alignment, it can make the relationship start to work better. It can move things towards closer emotional connection and towards commitment. Also, it can keep things moving forward after the two of you are in a relationship again, and it can help keep that relationship strong into the long run. And those three elements are, of course, being on the same team as opposed to seeing your opponent or seeing each other as being on opposite sides. It's having clear communication, and it's also building trust. Trust is built over time. I'm not going to go over the whole triangle here because we have that whole previous video on it, so definitely check that out if you missed it. But what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be talking a little bit more about the communication angle of that. And specifically, we're going to be talking about the gap. And typically, communication starts to experience challenges when there is a gap in understanding or a gap in someone's experience in a relationship or in a situation. And what we're going to be talking about is, as they say in the United Kingdom, mind the gap between train and platform. I've traveled to so many countries, and they always have some sort of version of that saying whenever you're getting off of the public transit, mind the gap between train and platform. And you want to be careful of that gap. And obviously you want to try to catch the gap when it's small and close it, rather than allowing it to grow larger and larger and then trying to close it then and there. So what we want to do is we want to minimize the gap. But first, let's talk a little bit more about the gap so that you can understand what the gap is, and then we'll kind of move forward from there. I originally thought that I was going to be able to cover all of this in maybe one video, but I think I'm going to have to break this up into this video here where we talk about the gap, and then maybe a second video where we go into some additional stuff about closing the gap. But let's just first start by talking about the gap. So the gap is when you think or believe something, and there's really no concrete evidence to prove it, and you start filling in the blanks, filling in those gaps with your thoughts, your conclusions that you're making, your own fears, your own anxieties, your own insecurities, or maybe your ex is filling in gaps in their experience as well too, with their own fears, insecurities, and all of that. And what we're going to be talking about is specifically that gap, how the gap relates to you, and also how the gap relates to your ex or your partner as well too. So first, when there are gaps and we start to fill them in, it can often be a setup for us not being on the same team. It can often express itself as poor communication. And if there are gaps that show up over time, they can kind of erode trust between two people. And so, like I said before, we want to close those gaps, preferably when they're relatively small. Although, since this is probably the first time you've heard me talk about any of this, you may have gaps in your situation that are quite large because they've just kind of grown that way over time. And obviously what we want to do is we want to close those gaps as much as we can so that we can have more communication, trust, and be on the same team with one another. So let's start by talking about gaps from our perspective. And this may sound familiar if you are familiar with our teachings about the BS machine. I might touch on that briefly. I know there are a lot of people in this group that have not been in our courses. Maybe they just recently found us, or maybe they just haven't signed up for our courses or something like that. So I'm going to briefly touch on this. But we go through our relationship, we go through our situation, and there are naturally going to be gaps that show up, things that we don't understand, things that we don't know why they happened or what the meaning is behind them. Okay. And so this might show up in many different ways. I've read a lot of comments, I've talked to a lot of people. It can show up in some ways, such as like, okay, why didn't they text me back for 6 hours or some period of time that seems longer than normal, right? Why did they do that? That's a gap. It seems like they're trying to create some sort of distance between the two of us. That's a gap. They seem suddenly indifferent about me, even though, just a month or so ago, we were really close emotionally. We were in a great relationship. Now suddenly they seem indifferent. Why is that? that's a gap. So these gaps are holes in our understanding about what's going on. And these are just naturally going to show up as we go through our life, as we go through our life with, people in a non-romantic context too. This can happen with maybe coworkers, this can happen with family members, this can happen with friends. But of course, we are here to talk about romantic relationships. So, you can obviously apply this to other areas of your life, but we're going to be talking about it through the lens of a romantic relationship. And so what we want to do is we want to notice these gaps first and foremost. We want to notice them. And then we want to also notice how we have this sort of instinctive urge to fill that gap. We have this instinctive urge to fill the gap with oftentimes our own fears, our own anxieties, and our own insecurities. So for example, it takes someone much longer than normal to text back. Why is that? Is it because they don't care? Is it because they're trying to send you a hint that you should give up? Is it because maybe something else is going on? Notice how your mind starts to fill it in and make meaning out of it. Your mind will naturally try to make meaning out of gaps, out of things that don't seem to align with maybe what you want or what you hope for. Maybe you might have your partner or your ex post something on social media, maybe a photo of them with an attractive person that, might be of the opposite sex or, whatever gender that they might be romantically interested in. And you might see this and there's a gap. Who is that person? Is that someone that they're dating? Is that someone that they're in a rebound relationship with? It could be. It could also be maybe their cousin who's visiting from out of town. It could be some long lost friend that they're just in a platonic dynamic with. We don't know. And so if you start to notice that your mind is racing to fill in that gap with your own insecurities, fears, and anxieties, such as like, oh my goodness, they're dating, they're out there, I've lost all my chances, they're moving on, they don't care about me anymore. This is you filling in that gap with what we call BS thoughts. This is what we call the BS machine. It's your inclination to fill in the gap with fear, insecurity, anxiety, things like that. And, I see this all the time. Someone's like, oh yeah, my ex won't respond to me. Like, what should I do? And then you just see all these people that, honestly, they seem kind of jaded and cynical. And they just say, oh, you got to take a hint. You got to move on, right? They're trying to send you something. Is that possibly what's going on? Sure. But how do we know? Why are we jumping to these catastrophe predictions in our mind when we don't have the full story? We're filling in the gap with our own fears, insecurities, and anxieties. Okay. And so notice if and when you start to see gaps in your situation from your perspective. Okay. And people will also come forward and they'll say, hey, my ex has their own BS machine. My ex is also filling in the gaps themselves. And it's absolutely true. Your ex will be filling in the gap themselves as well too. They might see you contacting them. They might see you trying to talk to them. They might see you asking them to meet up. And they might suddenly think like, oh, like, why are you doing that? Do you have this agenda of us getting back together? Are you just trying to force us to be in a relationship again without first, understanding me and where I'm at? And they may start to become cautious about your intentions. They may start to create distance because of that. And they are all just doing this because they filled in this gap in their experience by creating meaning out of it. Okay. And so this can often cause your ex to be what we call relationship focused. Let's go ahead and explain this because there are a lot of people in this group who are probably not in our courses. So there are two, at least in this regard, there are two ways that you can communicate to one another, and that is being connection focused and being relationship focused. And when you're being relationship focused, it's like your intention or your agenda or your thoughts are like, is this going to lead towards a committed relationship? And that can seem like a good thing if your ex is thinking that way, if your ex is relationship focused. But it can actually cause things to be really difficult because it causes them to sort of split their thinking into black and white thinking. They sort of think that, like, okay, if we're talking to each other, that means we're either going to be dating or getting back together, or we're going to be nothing at all. And although it might seem like that's a great way for your ex to be seeing things, it can also present a lot of problems because they might be emotionally in a place where they're not ready to make that decision. And if they feel pressured to make that decision when they don't have enough of an emotional connection with you, what's going to happen is they're probably just going to choose to stay still, stay where they're at right now, which is broken up with you. And so what we often want to do is we want to shift their expectation down from being relationship focused towards being connection focused. And when you're connection focused, you're not necessarily worried about what's this leading up to? Are we going to get back together? Are we not going to get back together? But instead, you're just simply enjoying the connection that you have between the two of you and letting whatever sort of relationship or dynamic or anything like that unfold naturally out of that. And so, um, if your ex is kind of filling in the gaps with their own relationship focused fears or insecurities, they're thinking, why are you contacting me? Is it because you want to get back together? Then that can often cause them to pull back because they may not be in an emotional place where they're ready to entertain that idea yet, because maybe the two of you haven't connected enough. And so what we want to do is we want to manage that as well too. And so your ex is going to have gaps. You're going to have gaps. And what we want to do is we want to first start by noticing when these gaps present themselves. And then, of course, we'll work on closing the gap. But we want to close the gap in order to have a stronger relationship and move that ball closer to the hole, because the wider the gaps are, the greater the disconnect is between the two of you when it comes to communication. And we're going to be talking about how to close the gaps in the next video. I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves here. I just want to first start by introducing the concept of the gap and making sure that it makes sense to everyone, and give you a little bit of fun work to work on as you kind of wrap your mind around this and as you think about it. And so the fun work, I'm not going to ask you to draw anything. You can if you want to. I've enjoyed seeing a lot of your, some of you have like really good artistic ability, which is really cool. I love seeing that sort of stuff. But what I want you to do for your fun work today, for at least this lesson here, is to leave a comment down below about a gap that either you are experiencing in your experience, and maybe what you feel tempted to fill that gap with. Like, oh my goodness, they what would be an example of a gap that you might experience in your situation? Like, they said, like, they're indifferent to me suddenly. My rush is to fill in that gap and think that, like, our relationship was so meaningless, didn't mean anything to them, that they've been able to bounce back after maybe just a couple weeks, because maybe your breakup was fairly recent or something like that. That might be a gap that you're rushing to fill in when you don't know if that's the case. You don't know if there could be something else going on that could be causing them that. Like, maybe they're just emotionally numbing themselves to avoid the pain. Maybe they are trying to put up this like armor to make it seem like they've moved on, so that they can create that distance because they're worried about you being relationship focused or something like that. But go ahead and notice a gap that you might be experiencing in your situation and how you feel tempted to fill it in with something. Or you can also notice a gap that your ex or your partner may be seeing in the situation with you, and maybe speculate about how they might be trying to fill that in, maybe with some sort of relationship focused fear or something like that. Okay, so please go ahead and post that below as your fun work for this video. And as we get ready for the next video, if we get enough comments and people doing the fun work for this video, we'll go ahead and we'll make the next video on closing that gap so that we can have better communication and a better connection with one another. Take care, thank you, and I will try to find another color shirt to wear for our next video. Take care. Talk to you next time.